Hello and welcome to the 2022 Milan No-Till Field Day, and specifically to the Natural Resources Tour. I'm Dr. David Mercker, Extension Forester with the University of Tennessee, and my office is located in Jackson. And this presentation today is going to be a little bit on the lighter side. We're going to be addressing the issue of acorns, and acorns is something that's of interest to a great deal of people, not just homeowners, but of course sportsmen, natural resource professionals as well. So let's launch into this as I share my screen, and we'll learn a little bit more about acorns. How do acorns develop? I want to begin with some examples of some acorns. Now, broadly, there are two different broad groups of oaks in the state of Tennessee, and that's red oak and white oak groups. And within each of them, well, we've got about 20 different oaks that are native to the state. 12 of them are in the red oak group, and 8 of them are in the white oak group. And I have some examples of acorns from both different groups here. I begin at 12 o'clock with the Bur Oak, and the Bur Oak produces the largest of all the acorns in our state. It's very large. It can even reach sometimes about the size of a tennis ball, but it's not uncommon for them to be the size of a handball, if you're familiar with that. But it's kind of a rare tree in Tennessee, found mostly in the Mississippi floodplain in the western part of the state. Continuing now clockwise, you'll see Shoemart Oak. That's one of the red oaks. Very common tree, and it's a prize tree, beautiful tree that produces fine lumber, attains great heights, and acorns tend to be large with it. Below that's the pin oak, another red oak. This is a smaller acorn with a very thin cap, and this acorn particularly is preferred by waterfowl. This tree tends to be found in the floodplains. It's not a very good lumber tree. It produces, well, it's just full of a lot of limbs, and so the quality of it's very poor. Blackjack oak at 6 o'clock here. Now, this is a red oak that's found on some of our driest sites in Tennessee. It can tolerate low moisture conditions. Again, not a very good lumber tree, but it certainly produces mass or acorns, fruit for wildlife on those sites. You'll see the chestnut oak next to it. That's one of the white oaks. Now, this acorn here is kind of dried up, it's shriveled, but it's typically a pretty large acorn, and the lumber is preferred. It's desirable and found around much of the state. And then overcup oak is a white oak that's found in the floodplains along with the Bur Oak, and it gets its name because the cap grows over the acorn itself, hence the name overcup. And then I've just thrown in here sawtooth oak as well. This is not a native oak to Tennessee, but it has been produced for its acorn production. It's a tree that grows rapidly, small tree, a roughly medium-sized tree, maybe 50 to 60, 70 feet tall is about all. It produces acorns abundantly, and a variety of wildlife prefer them. However, the acorns tend to mature early, and they're consumed by the time deer season rolls around. So acorns come in a variety of sizes and a variety of shapes. Let's talk a little bit about the differences between the red oak and white oak acorns, and they're grouped left and right here. Red oak produces an acorn that's bittery or kind of puckery in taste. It has tannin in it, which is bitter. It doesn't mean wildlife won't eat it. They certainly will consume it. If that's what's available, that's what they'll eat. But maybe if given a choice, they might prefer the white oak. Now, what's unique to red oak is that the acorns require 2 years to actually mature. And so they will fertilize this spring, but they'll actually go through a whole nother growing season, the current year and the following year, and then drop off in the fall of the second year. And so you might have one good year followed by a bad year and so forth. Now, the inner shell of the cap of the red oak is actually woolly. That differentiates it from the white oak. These germinate in the spring, so they have to go through a stratification period, which is a cold snap essentially, and that will cause them to germinate in the spring of the year. And then the leaves with red oak are bristle-tipped, which separates them from white oak. So in contrast, then we look at white oak. The acorn is sweet, relatively sweet to the taste. They mature in 1 year. And so in years, maybe when you don't have a good red oak crop, you might have a good white oak crop, which is a good way of assuring that wildlife have something to eat virtually every year. The inner shell of the acorn is smooth. They germinate in the fall of the year, usually, so they don't have to go through a stratification period. I know deer hunting in the fall, you'll see acorns and the root is already beginning to emerge from the seed itself. And then the leaves are rounded. So that's quickly some differences between the two. Continuing on here, oaks are a tree that are called monoecious as opposed to dioecious. In other words, both the male and female flowers are on the same tree. Potentially every tree then of reproductive age is capable of producing acorns, although not all of them do. So this makes it very good for cross-pollination because particularly if you have a lot of oaks in one general area, they will cross-pollinate each other, and that will lead to better fertility and higher acorn crop in the fall of the year. Now, red oaks tend to flower about 2 weeks earlier than white oaks do, and so overall, we've got about a month period between both species where the flowers are actually growing and pollinating. Pollen typically is shed then about 2 weeks after the male flowers appear. By that point, the female flowers will have appeared, and then the pollen is shed over about a 3 or 4 day period. A few more interesting notes on this is, well, here's an example of a red oak. This is new growth in the spring of the year. So we've got a southern red oak. You can tell that by the bell shape to the small leaf that's forming, southern red oak. The terminal bud produces this new stem each year. The terminal bud is the one on the end that produces the new stem, we call this primary growth. Now around the terminal bud, you'll see these flower buds, and from these emerge the male flowers. And so these are considered the male flowers, and they are sort of like beads on a string. The stem protrudes down, droops downward, and then the male flowers will form. These haven't opened up yet. But then the female flowers then will emerge on the primary growth. And you can see that right here and here. And so these, of course, will produce the pollen that will land on the female flower, and then fertilization is possible. Taking that further into the growing season then, what we've got here is a red oak, one of the red oaks. You can see the bristle tips on the end of the lobes. Now, these are the acorns that actually fertilized last year. Remember, I said that red oak required 2 years to mature. So these fertilized last year, and a year and a half, essentially 2 years later, they're ready to drop from the ground or drop to the ground. Now, if you notice though, here are the acorns that have formed this year. And so you see the pedestal and the small acorns that are forming. So you could sort of predict what kind of an acorn crop you're going to have over a 2 year period. Of course, a lot can play into that. These acorns could abort early if we have a drought or weevils bore into them and begin feeding on them. So what are the factors then that affect acorn production? Chief among them is the weather during pollination. This is the most influential, particularly excessive rain. A lot of times we think that excessive rain will be a good thing for acorn production, and it does help it during the growing season after the acorns have formed. But while they're fertilizing, while the pollination is occurring, we don't want excessive rain, because instead of the pollen floating around like it should, it drips off or it runs down the tree and it doesn't reach the female flower to receive the pollen. So cool, damp weather is not preferred. Of course, freezing, we do have late freezes periodically during the time when the male flowers are emerging, and that could kill the male flowers or even the female flowers and prevent pollination. And then even high wind. We do like some wind, light wind, but high wind, particularly if it's coming from one direction, let's say it's coming from the west quite a bit over that 2 or 3 day period, and it's blowing the pollen away from other oak trees, maybe out into a baseball diamond or toward housing subdivision where there aren't oak trees, then you might not have good pollination that year, good fertilization that year. Of course, insects have been mentioned already too. Weevils will bore into the acorns. The acorns are full of energy, the carbohydrate molecule, and so everything wants to consume that carbohydrate. And if they can get to it before the squirrels do or the deer do, then it's to their advantage, and they will bore into the tree, into the acorns, and cause the acorns to actually abort and fall off early. And drought, number 3, will do the same thing. We might have had good pollination, good fertilization, but then a drought occurs. It takes a lot of water to plumpen up an acorn. And so the tree will divert that moisture over to more life-sustaining needs. And in so doing, the acorns will fall off. You'll see acorns falling off maybe around July 4th, and you'll wonder what's going on. And they tend to be small and just maybe deformed. And then genetic makeup, of course, plays into it. Only about 33% of the oak trees are good producers. That's as referenced by our very own Dr. Craig Harper, our wildlife specialist. A few more factors. Of course, age plays into it as well. Most species of oak will begin producing acorns at about 20 years of age, or about 6 inches in diameter. Sometimes you'll see it a little earlier than that, but that's typical. And then they will continue to produce acorns and through about age 50 to 80, sometimes older than that, but this tends to be where it peaks anyway. Of course, a lot of things play into that. The stocking of the forest. Is it overstocked where the trees are beginning to die by the time they're 50 years old? And then acorn production improves with healthy trees, and this is pretty key, healthy trees in dominant crown positions and on good sites. So what do we mean by that? Dominant crown position means that the trees have their heads up above the adjacent trees. So they have plenty of sunlight to help produce the acorns. And then it's site related too. As you can imagine, trees tend to be healthier when we have good soils as opposed to something that's maybe really dry, rocky outcropping, and so forth. And then a year of heavy acorn production may actually use up all the stored nitrogen, and then the following year, few acorns may be produced. So obviously, it's very difficult to predict. So the majority then of the acorns are not viable at all. If they don't get consumed by wildlife, then they're subject to being predated upon by insects as well. And then, of course, drought plays into it. And the exact number, I'm not confident enough to predict that, but it wouldn't surprise me if only 10% of the acorns actually are viable and get planted into the ground by squirrels and survive and actually germinate. So this would be a seedling after it is germinated. You see the root or the radicle and the seedling. So getting an oak seedling to 4 foot tall really is a great accomplishment when you consider everything that it has to go through and everything that wants to consume it. Consider the pollination, the weather, predation, sunlight. Even if the seedling does germinate, will it grow very well? Is there enough sunlight for the seedling to make it to this 4 foot tall seedling here that Dr. Clatterbuck's left hand is on? Pretty rare. Well, the question becomes, and I get this one a lot, should you fertilize trees to produce more and sweeter acorns? Well, according to Dr. Craig Harper's research, there are no data that support the notion that fertilizing oaks leads to increased acorn production. There's only 1 or 2 good mast years out of 5, and this is not related to soil nutrients. Rather, it's related to poor pollination, late frost, drought, and acorn weevils. All these things limit acorn production, regardless of whether the tree is fertilized or not. And then a follow-up question, do all oak trees produce equally? Well, over a 3-year period, what Dr. Harper found was that among individual trees, 25% of the white oaks produced 90%, 87%, and 67% of the acorns over a 3-year period. So again, roughly 1/4 of the trees are producing, roughly about 80% of the acorns. So it comes down to finding those jewels, those gems, those ones that are really productive, and those are the ones that you might want to favor and release and help make sure that those trees survive and thrive. Well, that concludes this brief little presentation. I thank you for your participation today. I want to also point you to a publication on the very same topic, How Do Acorns Develop? There's the website that it can be found at, or you can just Google that title and my last name, and you'll be able to find it that way too. So thanks for your attention, and good luck with your acorn production.